Good evening and welcome to this week's breakdown. My name's Chris Morris and each week I'll be breaking down the corporate fascist state in which we live and the consequences of it. Just like to mention before we begin today that to encourage you to visit the website flippingthepyramid.co.uk and where you can download this programme and others like it and all the other shows from the other hosts on the station. And in addition to that, you can also listen to this programme after it's been broadcast today on my YouTube channel, which is Breakdown Radio Show, or one word. As I mentioned last week, I'm going to be discussing Anglo-American foreign policy, post-Second World War Anglo-American foreign policy today. I did mention last week that this was an extremely large task, and having looked at it, I've decided that the best thing to do is to really split this into two parts. So this is going to be a two-part programme, beginning this week and continuing next week. The only other option is to do something, it is to either skirt over the subject in a level of detail that is not satisfactory and miss out lots of important stuff, or alternatively make a ridiculously long programme. And I realise I'm a very engaging and entertaining character, but I'm not sure anyone wants to listen to me for 3.5 hours. So I'll probably make... So there's going to be two programmes. I would estimate there'll probably be about 3.5 hours in total, which is too much for one programme, really. So I'm going to begin today by looking at the early post-Second World War US foreign policy. It's particularly relevant to be looking at foreign policy with the situation in Syria being escalated as we speak. There's an article here from RT from the 6th of December that's headlined "Thousands of US troops arrived near Syrian shore on USS Eisenhower." This was not reported by the Western media at all. I haven't seen any. There are numerous sources for this. This is just one of the sources, and it's been picked up by the alternative media as well, but I haven't seen any Western media reporting this whatsoever. They did spend a lot of time talking about Kay Middleton's morning sickness though, so that was useful. Just briefly read from this article: the USS Eisenhower, an American aircraft carrier that holds 8 fighter bomber squadrons and 8,000 men, arrived at the Syrian coast yesterday in the midst of a heavy storm, indicating US preparation for a potential ground intervention. If the US decides to intervene militarily in Syria, it now has at its disposal 10,000 fighting men, 17 warships, 70 fighter bombers, 10 destroyers and frigates, and guided military cruisers. Some of the vessels are also equipped with Aegis missile interceptors to shoot down any missiles Syria might have at hand, according to Debka file. So you can see, you can read the whole article if you look up the headline, or go to the chat room at Flipping the Pyramid, and the link is in there. But with this week, we've seen the UN and William Hague and the United States all saying, "Oh, Syria shouldn't use chemical weapons. It could be really dangerous. It could be a terrible thing. You know, we would have to intervene. NATO would have to intervene. It's not like we want to intervene. You know, there's been this 10-year propaganda build-up against Syria, but it's not like we want to have a ground intervention. You know, we're just doing it because we care about the people. We can't have a dictator like Assad using chemical weapons. You know, I've already contextualised this in previous weeks, and I find it highly unlikely that Assad would use chemical weapons in this particular situation, where he'd be under great pressure, and he knows definitely that it will result in a ground intervention. So if there are any reports of chemical weapons being used in Syria, and this is being used as the justification for some form of NATO intervention, then obviously we need to be very wary as to what exactly has occurred. But to move on to discussing the Anglo-American post-Second World War foreign policy, I think it's important to emphasise firstly, as the programme continues and I begin to discuss these issues and what has actually occurred, what is part of the historical record, and cannot be denied reasonably. In fact, cannot be denied at all because it's all documented. It will become clear that the way that this foreign policy has been sold to the people, and the way that the nations of Britain and America are essentially presented as being, in our everyday lives and by our political leaders through their public statements. It is completely inaccurate. It has no basis in reality. It has no relation to what really goes on. But we're perpetually told that the military interventions that take place, which are always overseas, of course, because the mainland of Britain, the United States, is never threatened. They're either being driven by the spread of democracy or getting rid of some rogue dictator, or to protect Britain and the United States against some sort of perceived external threat. And we see one of these two explanations then being pronounced as being in either Britain or America's interests, or both. And we see this pattern time and time again, and the public statements of the major political figures in Britain and America are completely consistent with this going back decades. But I'll just read some recent statements from British Prime Ministers and American Presidents that show you that this is always the rhetoric that's used every single time. So we've got William Jefferson Clinton, the 3rd of September 1996. The Iraqi attack adds fuel to the factional fire and threatens to spark instability throughout the region. Our objectives are limited but clear: to make Saddam pay a price for the latest act of brutality, reducing his ability to threaten his neighbours and America's interests. And George W. Bush, the 7th of October 2001. I recently received a touching letter that says a lot about the state of America in these difficult times. A letter from a 4th grade girl with a father in the military. As much as I don't want my dad to fight, she wrote, I'm willing to give him to you. This is a precious gift, the greatest she could give. This young girl knows what America is all about. Since September the 11th, an entire generation of young Americans has gained new understanding of the value of freedom and its cost and duty and its sacrifice. The battle is now joined on many fronts. We will not waver, we will not tire, we will not falter, we will not fail. Peace and freedom will prevail. I love it when they say we in these statements. We had Hillary Clinton. I played a clip of her the other week, speaking at somewhere, and she was saying, "We will do this. We went into Pakistan. We? When did you do anything?" On exactly the same day, Tony Blair said the following: "The world understands that whilst of course there are dangers in acting, as we are, the dangers of inaction are far, far greater. The threat of further such outrages, the threats to our economies, the threats to the stability of the world." Yeah, because, our economies worked out really well in the long run after taking this action, didn't they? I also want to say very directly to the British people why this matters so much to Britain. First, let us not forget that the attacks of the 11th of September represented the worst terrorist outrage against British citizens in our history. The murder of British citizens, whether it happened overseas or not, is an attack upon Britain. But even if no British citizen had died, we would be right to act. This atrocity was an attack on us all, on people of all faiths and people of none. Yeah, it's just an attack on everyone. It doesn't matter if you've got any faith or not. You were definitely attacked when a few people died in New York one day. You were attacked. It doesn't matter if you agree with them. It doesn't matter if you don't agree with them. It doesn't matter if it had happened. It doesn't matter if it didn't happen. You were still attacked, regardless of whatever the circumstances were. We know the Al-Qaeda network threatened Europe, including Britain, and indeed any nation throughout the world that does not share their fanatical views. So we have a direct interest in acting in our self-defence to protect British lives. It was an attack on lives and livelihoods. George W. Bush, 26th February 2003. The safety of the American people depends on ending this direct and growing threat. I assume he's referring to international terrorism. Acting against the danger will also contribute greatly to the long-term safety and stability of our world. The current Iraqi regime has shown the power of tyranny to spread discord and violence in the Middle East. A liberated Iraq can show the power of freedom to transform that vital region by bringing hope and progress into the lives of millions. America's interest in security and America's belief in liberty both lead in the same direction, to a free and peaceful Iraq. And then on the 25th of September 2005, Tony Blair said, "There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that what is happening in Iraq now is crucial for our own security. Never mind the security of Iraq or the Greater Middle East, it is crucial for the security of the world." So they have just absolutely relentless crap, really, from start to finish. But as the programme develops and as I go into discussing the legacy of Anglo-American foreign policy, I want you to bear those statements in mind and see how closely they actually marry up to what has actually occurred. So I think anyone can quite reasonably say that I mean, I won't be actually getting into discussing the issues that they're describing there, because this is going to be for today. Firstly, dealing with the first half of the post-Second World War period, but I think anyone can reasonably say that Britain and America's actions over the period that's been discussed there has not led to greater security. It's not. They've not achieved one thing that they said they were setting out to achieve, and of course, if you set the actual actions of the Anglo-American establishment in context and what they've actually done over this 65 to 70 year period, to say they're acting in the interests of peace, liberty, security, America's interests, Britain's interests, us as a people, well, I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not that can reasonably be described as accurate. Okay, although I'm mostly going to be discussing the post-Second World War foreign policy, I have to begin by discussing the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, still the only time that atomic weaponry has ever been utilised. This was infamously carried out by the Enola Gay bomber of the United States military, and the effects on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were predictably devastating. There have been various estimates regarding the death toll. However, in December 1977, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists asserted that a 1967 United Nations estimate, which gave a death toll of 67,000 at Hiroshima alone, was a gross underestimation, and concluded that the number of deaths by the end of 1945 had been hypothesised to be 140,000 by expert analysts, although this was also likely to be an underestimation. However, even these sort of sobering figures of hundreds of thousands of deaths do not come close to giving a true indication of the destruction and suffering that was imposed upon the two cities. There's been some debate regarding the bombings, with some seeking to justify it by stating that it was necessary for the United States to carry them out in order to gain victory in the Pacific region during the Second World War. Others have stated that the Japanese were on the verge of surrender and that this was merely an opportunity for the United States to test a form of technology that had never been utilised before, and that would be difficult to justifiably utilise in a different context. Others state that the context is irrelevant. I would be one of these people, and that such an action can never be defended. However, in The Nation magazine in August 2010, it was rightly pointed out that if the argument in favour of these atomic bombings was so airtight, why was US military shot footage and Japanese film of the aftermath suppressed for 25 years? There was a film shot at the time by a company called Nippon Iga Sha in Japan, and ultimately this was suppressed and confiscated by the US military. The person involved, or one of the people primarily involved, was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel McGovern, and he said the following about this suppression of this film. "I always had the sense that people in the Atomic Energy Commission were sorry we had dropped the bomb. The Air Force, it was also sorry. I was also told by people in the Pentagon that they didn't want those images out because they showed effects on man, woman and child. They didn't want the general public to know what their weapons had done. At a time they were planning on more bomb tests. We didn't want the material out because we were sorry for our sins." It's an incredibly optimistic view of why the film was suppressed, but you can now view this film on YouTube should you wish to do so, and it's not a particularly enjoyable watch, but I think it's something that people should watch just so you can see the devastation that was caused. In 1948, Frank Wisner, or Wisner, depending on how you want to pronounce it, then head of the Central Intelligence Agency's Official of Special Programs, was given the task of engaging in propaganda efforts for the United States. Other key players in this scheme were Alan Dulles and Richard Helms, who were both future directors of the Central Intelligence Agency. Numerous accounts also suggest that a fourth associate in this scheme was Philip Graham, who was then the publisher of the Washington Post, still a very famous establishment-supporting newspaper. From the beginning of the 1950s, the CIA sought to control and shape the way that intelligence activities were reported in the US media. Thus, Operation Mockingbird was born in 1951. This was a concerted propaganda program that targeted reporting in US newspapers, magazines, journals and period film. The scale of Mockingbird has been open to debate, but published accounts show that 400 journalists participated in it for definite, with 25 newspapers and wire agencies under its influence by the early 1950s. Numerous journalists in the US were linked with the programme, as well as media executives Henry Luce of Time magazine and Newsweek as well, and Arthur Hayes Sulzberger of the New York Times, and the aforementioned Philip Graham. Mockingbird activities ranged from suppressing news stories at home, such as the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala, which I'll be coming to in due course, to having favourable and nationalistic stories and commentaries printed in various publications, to using newspaper and magazine outlets as a cover for stationing agents abroad. So it was a full-scale propaganda programme that made the press into little more than a mouthpiece for the establishment. Shortly after this, Operation Mockingbird was tested out for the first time when Operation Ajax was carried out. Discussed that extensively in last week's programme, but this was the coup to overthrow the popular and democratically elected Mossadegh government in Iran. Just months after Operation Ajax took place, the United States began a second similar operation, with the CIA plotting and organising a coup to overthrow Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, the democratically elected president of Guatemala. Arbenz's government put forth a raft of new policies when he was elected, among which was the inclusion of the reclamation of unfarmed land that private corporations had set aside for their operations in order to make this land available to peasants. A very noble policy. Arbenz's original election had taken place in March 1951 and it owed much to this policy of land reform. When he had assumed office, 70% of Guatemala's arable lands were owned by less than 2.5% of the population, with the majority of these people not even resident in the country. Almost immediately, when he was elected, Arbenz began redistributing the land to some 100,000 peasants whose incomes averaged less than $8 per month. Unfortunately for American business interests, Arbenz's plans involved some 400,000 acres of banana plantation lands that had been earmarked for development by the multinational United Fruit Company. This company was to later become Chiquita, who very much a reviled company in the so-called banana republics. This occurred in 1984. United Fruit Company at this time was effectively the largest landowner in Guatemala. Arbenz also had demanded that foreign corporations such as United Fruit were ordered to pay more taxes, which is essentially a protectionist policy. If you recall, a few weeks ago I was discussing how the processes that took place in the post-Bretton Woods world have been aiming towards eradicating protectionist measures, eradicating trade tariffs and stuff like that, eradicating anything that will allow a country's national produce to be prioritised over the products of multinational corporations. There was some negotiation then between the Arbenz government and United Fruit, with the Guatemalan government demanding $16 million for the land and the United Fruit Company offering $600,000. So essentially they couldn't come to an agreement at this point in time. If you look at United Fruit at that time, its ties to the CIA have been well documented. General Walter Bedell Smith, a former United Fruit executive, later was promoted to the company's board of directors, was also a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Dulles brothers, Alan Dulles, who was previously involved in Operation Ajax, and John Foster Dulles provided legal services for United Fruit throughout their association with the New York law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. It's important to emphasise something important about Operation PV's success, something that it has in common with Operation Ajax, but I think probably even more stark in this case just because of the nature of what you're dealing with, which is that United States actions served no geostrategic purpose whatsoever. They couldn't conceivably claim that Guatemala or Arbenz was a threat to American interests, or that they were in any way dangerous, or that their operation didn't even serve the most hawkish rationale. it just had no other purpose other than to grant United Fruit access to the land in Guatemala. The CIA actually carried out a massive operation in June 1954 that was called Operation PB History. This was just an attempt to demonstrate that Arbenz could be linked to the Soviet Union or broader communist sympathies. Not that that would in any way justify it, but this could be put forward as an argument as to why it was taking place. However, despite sifting through 500,000 documents, the CIA admitted they could find very little evidence of any interest of the Arbenz administration in communism outside of their borders, and virtually zero links with the Soviet Union. But the operation went ahead anyway. The United States acted purely in the interests of the multinational United Fruit Company. Their actions served no other legitimate purpose, and there was no other rationale for them whatsoever. The coup is often placed in the context of the McCarthyist era of the United States, in which the US went to huge lengths to suppress the supposed spread of communism. However, the term McCarthyism is now considered to mean the use of unfair investigatory or accusatory methods in order to suppress opposition, which would seem to be far more apt as what was actually occurring here. Eisenhower was the president at this time, the person who had agreed to Operation Ajax, the first US president to overthrow a democratically elected government with the help of US military intelligence operations. And he soon authorised the CIA to begin operations aimed at undermining and overthrowing Arbenz. The code-named Operation PB Success was, as stated by one CIA operative, not in any sense a conventional military operation, but rather the intention of it was to present the Guatemalan military with a choice between Arbenz and the, quote, counter-revolutionary forces that would be organised and funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. And the United States would support the latter, and then the Army's survival was really dependent upon them making the appropriate choice between favouring their own people and favouring the United States military. Should the military continue to align itself with Arbenz, they faced the distinct probability of being slaughtered. The operation was approved by Eisenhower in August 1953. It began by depositing money in Swiss bank accounts to try to persuade Arbenz to resign, which he was not willing to go along with. So the CIA then flew planes over Guatemala and dropped anti-Arbenz leaflets, as well as broadcasting anti-Arbenz messages over the Guatemalan airwaves from locations in Honduras, the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua. The process was also aided by security treaties that were signed with Honduras and Nicaragua prior to the operation. Declassified documents have also shown that there were CIA plans in place to murder Guatemalan officials. These plans are discussed in a document entitled A Study of Assassination. And you can actually see all these declassified documents online. The actual presidential decree that signed Operation PB Success into existence is available online so that you can view it. The US then began a naval blockade against Guatemala in May 1954, while the United States began to make public statements criticising Arbenz's, quote, undemocratic crackdown on the press that he had instituted in response to the United States' aforementioned operations. So you can really see from that how shameless and two-faced they're capable of being. On the one hand, running Operation Mockingbird to ensure that their own people don't get to hear what's really going on with their operations abroad. And then on the other hand, they're planning to overthrow a democratically elected and popular government because they're acting against corporate interests, but at the same time decrying the same government for being undemocratic. These are the kind of double standards, and I mean, it's not even double standards, it's just sheer barefaced hypocrisy. And it's just lies and corruption. Meanwhile, while this was going on, the CIA was also pulling strings in the United States, with the New York Times printing an article in June 1954 describing support amongst the Guatemalan military for the besieged government. Once this article had been read, Frank Wisner, I mentioned previously, he telephoned the CIA director Alan Dulles and then issued a memorandum suggesting that Dulles complained personally to the New York Times publisher, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, who I also mentioned previously, about this article. And they managed to persuade the New York Times to print favourable copy from that point onwards about the operation, and also Time magazine's coverage of the issue was completely sympathetic to the CIA viewpoint, frequently emphasising Arbenz' supposedly communist perspective and scoffing at Arbenz's claims that the United States were planning to invade the country. Although, inconveniently for Time magazine, this of course turned out to be true. Nevertheless, due to Operation Mockingbird and the efforts of the CIA within the United States, all reporters agreed to drop words such as invasion from their coverage of the Guatemalan issue. Eisenhower gave his green light to the attack in 15th of June 1954, and then on the 18th of June, a CIA-sponsored army consisting of Guatemalan expatriates and Honduran, Nicaraguan and American mercenaries crossed the Honduran border into Guatemala and began marching on Guatemala City. This small army would have posed little match for the Guatemalan army, but CIA-sponsored radio announcements had greatly exaggerated the size of the force, and this panicked many of Arbenz's military commanders into defecting to Nicaragua. And it also led to the complete grounding of Guatemala's air force, at which point the CIA's P-47 and P-51 fighters began bombing and strafing military installations. By 25th of June, most of the soldiers in the demoralised and bombarded Guatemalan army were refusing to fight, and within 2 days Arbenz resigned and fled to Mexico. Arbenz was doing many great things for the country of Guatemala, apart from the land repatriation that I described previously. There are many books that have been written about this, one of which is Piero Gligesi's Shattered Hope, the Guatemalan Revolution in the United States, 1944 to 1954, which is an exhaustive record of Arbenz and this period in Guatemala's history. As a result of the United States federal government and the CIA policy, 200,000 Guatemalans were murdered by death squads sponsored by military governments, most of them with weapons imported from the United States. Throughout this time, the United States characterised the democratic government of Arbenz as communist, when all the documents they examined showed they had no ties with tyrannical communism and zero links to the Soviet Union. They undermined it with covert intelligence operations, overthrew it militarily, and then put governments in place that ruled tyrannically over the land and killed hundreds of thousands of people. But the good news was, the United Fruit got what it wanted. When the United Nations Security Council considered Guatemala's complaints about the US invasion in 1954, which received considerable support from virtually everyone in the United Nations Security Council, Churchill ordered that Britain abstain on the request. Eisenhower later thanked Britain for its, quote, willingness to cooperate in regard to the UN aspect of US policy. Doubtless Britain would have offered military support to the United States as well. Unfortunately, they were too busy at the time overthrowing the democratically elected government of Guyana. In 1956, Britain invaded Egypt to remove the so-called nationalist president Gamal Abdel Nasser Hussein. Hussein had nationalised the Suez Canal Company and taken control of the region's oil supplies. Britain feared that by nationalising the Suez Canal Company, Nasser was, quote, using the revenues for her own internal purposes, whereas Britain regarded the Suez Canal as, quote, an international asset that was vital to the, quote, free world. This was put by Prime Minister Anthony Eden in a memorandum to Eisenhower on the 27th of July 1956, pointing out that this supposedly posed an, quote, immediate threat to the oil supplies to Western Europe. The MI6 made numerous assassination attempts against Nasser before eventually invading Egypt in October 1956, eventually being forced to withdraw due to financial pressures. The people of Britain benefited so much from this that although rationing had only ended in Britain in 1954, petrol rationing was again introduced during the so-called Suez Crisis. Throughout the late 1950s and up to 1960, the United States persistently attempted to remove Laos Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma from power. In 1958 they were successful when a CIA-backed coup removed Souvanna and the political organisation the Pathet Lao and replaced them with a pro-American regime that soon received assistance from US military advisors. Phouma later regained power, however the CIA staged coups in Laos in each of the years from 1958 to 1960. The US had poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Laos, a small kingdom that was 99% agricultural, and by doing so it created huge amounts of bribery and corruption. By simply halting these payments, the Americans could cause any Lao army to rebel. As Roger Hilsman wrote on the matter and on the subject of Laos, by merely withholding the monthly payments to troops, the United States could create the conditions for toppling any Lao government whose policies it opposed. As it turned out, in fact, the United States used this policy twice, to bring down the government of one Laos leader and to later break the will of another. During this period, the CIA also rigged elections in Laos by stuffing ballot boxes with erroneous votes, again emphasising their belief in the importance of democracy. In 1960, the CIA assassinated the first legally elected Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, after he helped the country gain independence from Belgium. Lumumba had been overthrown by a coup earlier that year, although he still retained popular support within the nation. Declassified documents show that President Eisenhower directly ordered the CIA to assassinate Lumumba. Minutes of a National Security Council meeting from August 1960 show that Eisenhower ordered aforementioned CIA chief Allen Dulles to, quote, eliminate Lumumba. The official note-taker Robert H. Johnson had informed the Senate International Committee of precisely this, later in 1975. Details of a cable sent from Dulles to CIA operatives in the Republic of Congo give details of why this action was authorised, stating that he was a threat to American policy in the Congo and all of Africa. Whenever Lumumba spoke, people listened and tended to follow him. Therefore, the CIA station in the Congo was instructed to prevent him from speaking publicly until he had been successfully assassinated, so that he could not rally any support in his favour. The cable also explained the fear of the US government that the democratically elected parliament in the Congo could reconvene and would likely re-elect Lumumba as Prime Minister. The CIA was instructed to ensure that this didn't happen, once again emphasising the US's belief in democracy. In the present day, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund and CIA all agree that the Congo is the poorest nation in the world in terms of GDP per capita. Although they've now added the word democratic to the title of their country since they assassinated that democratic leader. Two excellent books that cover the full story behind these events are The Assassination of Lumumba by Ludo de Vita and Lumumba, Africa's Lost Leader by Leo Zielig. Eisenhower was later to go on in his farewell address to give the deeply hypocritical military-industrial complex speech in which he warned Americans of the danger of a military-industrial commingled interest essentially becoming too powerful for the government to contain, which is pretty hypocritical considering all the stuff that he'd been involved in. And he was involved in the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which was the Bay of Pigs invasion. The United States were involved in this in April 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an ultimately unsuccessful attempt by a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. On the 16th of March 1960, a meeting of the US National Security Council, Eisenhower had approved a document that was prepared by the 5412 Committee, which was a subcommittee of the UN Security Council which was dedicated to organising covert action, which authorised the covert overthrow of Castro while attempting to keep American involvement confidential. To quote from that particular document, quote, "The purpose of the programme outlined herein is to bring about the replacement of the Castro regime with one more devoted to the true interests of the Cuban people and more acceptable to the US in such a manner as to avoid any appearance of US intervention. Essentially, the method of accomplishing this end will be to induce support and, so far as possible, direct action, both inside and outside of Cuba, by selected groups of Cubans of a sort that they might be expected to and could undertake on their own initiative." The plan was to comprise four initiatives: the creation of a unified Cuban opposition to the Castro regime, a propaganda regime via a long and short wave grey broadcasting facility, covert intelligence and action organisation within Cuba which will be responsive to the orders and direction of the exile opposition, and the development of an adequate paramilitary force outside of Cuba. Throughout 1960, the CIA engaged in training guerrilla forces for the purposes of the invasion in the treacherous, densely forested Sierra Madre in Guatemala. In November 1960, the CIA sent a cable officially cancelling guerrilla training for the majority of participants and specifying that the force would instead be trained for conventional warfare, indicating a major escalation of the type of operation to be mounted in Cuba. On the 27th of November 1960, President-elect Kennedy was briefed on the action and encouraged Dulles to continue. The US also created a clandestine air force. Attacks on airfields in Cuba began on the 15th of April 1961. The same day, the Cuban Foreign Minister Raul Roa accused the US of aggressive airstrikes against Cuba at the United Nations. In response, US Ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, stated that US armed forces would not, quote, under any conditions intervene in Cuba, and the US would do everything in its power to ensure that no US citizens would participate in actions against Cuba. Just more barefaced lies again. Stevenson also told the UN that planes involved were Castro's own Air Force planes that took off from Castro's own Air Force fields. So again, just more barefaced lies. After 7 days of intensive airstrikes from Castro's own planes attacking his own Air Force installations, and a ground invasion involving tank battles that led to an estimated 4,000 Cubans being wounded, missing in action or killed, it became evident that the CIA-trained Cubans were not going to receive adequate support at the site of the invasion and were highly likely to lose. Thus, Kennedy cancelled several planned sorties of bombing raids. So, an important thing to emphasise with that is that this is Kennedy, the whiter-than-white figure, who everyone looks back at nostalgically and thinks that when he was killed, a part of America died because he was such a good guy. He wasn't a good guy because he was involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he agreed. He essentially rubber-stamped it before he was even elected president. So, don't weep any tears for that particular individual. The invasion was an embarrassment for the Kennedy administration, partly due to its failure, detracting from the usual American bombast and propaganda attempts, but also because it strengthened revolutionary and pro-Castro feelings in Cuba. In addition, as acknowledged by the November 1961 review of the operation, developing the project from guerrilla support to overt armed action left the United States federal government in a position where they could no longer engage in, quote, plausible deniability of US involvement. Although they attempted to anyway, with Robert Kennedy making a statement in 20th of April 1961 in which he denied any US involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion. But you can now see all the declassified documents in which it was all signed off. I mean, it's part of documented history anyway, so there's no way they can even conceivably contest what's been said here, but you can actually see all the declassified documents from the Bay of Pigs invasion now. And you can also see Kennedy's statements, the signed off statements that he made, that those complete lies as well. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, America were not finished with trying to overthrow Castro or provoke the situation in Cuba. Castro appeared disinclined to launch any attacks against American targets or interests, which could have been used as the precept for a military invasion. So the only option left open to the United States was to manipulate the public image of Cuba. A Joint Chiefs document from this time stated that world opinion in the United Nations Forum should be favourably affected by developing the international image of Cuban government as rash and irresponsible, and as an alarming and unpredictable threat to the peace of the Western Hemisphere. This concept was given a concrete basis by the now declassified Operation Northwoods plan that was delivered to the Secretary of Defence Robert McNamara on the 13th of March 1962. This plan advocated a secret and deadly plan of terrorism against their own people in order to set American opinion against the Cubans and give a pretext for sustained invasion. The plans call for innocent people to be shot on American streets, for boats carrying refugees fleeing Cuba to be sunk, for commercial airliners to be hijacked, and for a wave of violent terrorism to be launched in Washington, Miami and other major American cities by US intelligence agencies under the pretext that they could be then blamed on the Cubans. One of the quotes that's often given from this particular document is, "We could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in US newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation." The plans were approved by all Joint Chiefs of Staff before being presented to Defence Secretary McNamara, but were ultimately not implemented. Some people are sometimes critical of reference to this scheme, and I've even heard it described as a conspiracy theory, even though you can see all the declassified documents, and I'm just quoting from the declassified documents here. But some people are critical of this because it wasn't carried out, but it needs to be emphasised and understood that the Joint Chiefs of Staff are some of the most powerful people in the American government, and the fact that they not only proposed to murder American citizens in order to achieve foreign policy goals, but had drawn up a demonstrable plan, had all agreed on it and put it before McNamara, should be considered very significant indeed. This plan was merely one rubber stamp away from being implemented, and had McNamara advocated its implementation, it would ultimately have been carried out, because it would have been accepted and executed by Kennedy on McNamara's wishes and advice. Nonetheless, despite the failed attempt at the Bay of Pigs invasion and the aborted Operation Northwoods, Kennedy still authorised Operation Mongoose, which is a series of by now familiar covert CIA actions within Cuba, which were designed to undermine and overthrow Castro. This ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis standoff with the Soviet Union, which is quite a famous incident, which could be discussed in some depth. I just briefly want to mention one thing that I've mentioned before, which is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russian submarines that thought they were under attack from US destroyers were carrying nuclear-tipped missiles. Two of the commanders authorised the use of these missiles, and a third commander by the name of Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov vetoed this decision. Had these nuclear-tipped missiles been fired, it almost certainly would have led to a full-scale nuclear war. And the consequences of this obviously would have been absolutely massive, and the only reason this would have taken place was because the United States wanted to overthrow Castro. And the only reason they wanted to overthrow Castro was for propaganda reasons. It wasn't for any legitimate American interest or any legitimate reason that he posed any threat to anyone, or that he posed a threat to the Cuban people, or that he was somehow authoritarian in nature. I mean, you could argue that he is authoritarian in nature, but that had nothing to do with the reason why he was overthrown. He was purely overthrown for propaganda reasons. He was purely overthrown because the US government and the elite interests that fund it and back it up and benefit from its actions wanted it to happen. And in order to do that, they were willing to get to a situation where we were one word away from being completely obliterated. So that's an indication of how crazy these people are. And, been talking about nuclear war in recent weeks, and I hope it's something I never see, obviously, but it's not something we can rule out with these people because they just don't give a shit. Dag Hjalmar Agner Carl Hammarskjöld was a Swedish diplomat and politician who served as Secretary General of the United Nations from April 1953 until September 1961. Hammarskjöld was a very popular and respected man, and President John F. Kennedy described him as the following. He said about Hammarskjöld, "I realise now that in comparison to him, I am a small man. He was the greatest statesman of our century." Hammarskjöld died in September 1961 while on a plane journey to Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, on a trip to mediate peace between the Republic of Congo and the breakaway province of Katanga. The plane carrying Hammarskjöld exploded shortly before it was due to land in Rhodesia. In August 1998, Archbishop Desmond Tutu revealed letters from South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission that heavily implicated Britain, the United States and South Africa in the murder and death of Hammarskjöld. The letters describe meetings between MI5, the CIA and a South African military front company, and plans to place dynamite in the wheel bay of the aircraft. The Commission released all the documents in its possession in relation to this, but the British Foreign Office simply denied any involvement. Earlier that year, in July 1961, Britain had begun an invasion of Kuwait. Kuwait had recently become independent, and the British government concocted a justification for the invasion revolving around the argument that Iraq posed a serious threat to Kuwaiti sovereignty. A later Ministry of Defence report conceded that such a threat from Iraq was, quote, unlikely. Coincidentally, Kuwait was at that time the third largest oil-producing country in the world, and the exploitation of this supply was contracted to the Kuwait Oil Company. Although you shouldn't be fooled by the name of that particular company because it was owned equally by British Petroleum and the American Gulf Oil Corporation. Of course, the major concern was that this newly independent nation, as with Mossadegh in Iran, would sever ties with the United Kingdom and nationalise its oil supply. In September 1962, the Imam of North Yemen, North Yemen's now a part of the United Republic of Yemen since its merger with South Yemen in 1990. The Imam of North Yemen was overthrown in a popular coup, having only been in power for a week following the death of his father, who had resided over what could reasonably be described as a feudal kingdom dominated by peasantry and an arbitrary and coercive taxation system. Sounds familiar. Declassified documents showed that Britain soon resorted to covert action to attempt to undermine the new Republican regime in alliance with Saudi Arabians and Jordanians. The files show that the British were completely aware that they were supporting the wrong side in Jordan from a moral perspective. Christopher Gandhi, who was Britain's top official in Taiz in North Yemen, and Britain's top official there, noted shortly after the revolution that the rule of the previous Imam, quote, has made the Imamate unpopular with large elements and those in many ways the best. The, quote, monopoly of power was, quote, much resented, was exploited by the new Republican government by appointing into office people from, quote, classes, regions and sects previously neglected in the distribution of power. Gandhi described the Imam's rule as, quote, an arbitrary autocracy, while the Republicans were acting collectively through a new government and were, quote, much more open to contact and reason argument. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan himself admitted that it was, quote, repugnant to political equity and prudence alike that we should so often appear to be supporting out-of-date and despotic regimes and to be opposing the growth of modern and more democratic forms of government. The Foreign Secretary Alex Douglas Home also conceded that the Republicans' quote, attraction for the average Yemeni will be greater than the Imams, and this would, quote, cause us a great deal of trouble. As a result of Britain's actions, a civil war raged in North Yemen for 8 years, during which time MI6 retained a presence and went to considerable lengths to attempt to influence the outcome between 1965 and 1967. Their actions included chartering aircraft with discrete pilots, obtaining the agreement of Israel to use its territory for mounting these operations. So I think I'll take a break at this point because we're on the verge of Vietnam, and that seems like a good point as any to take a particular break, and I could do with a drink anyway. So I'll just play a quick record and then I'll be back in a few minutes. On the 4th of August 1964, the American destroyer warship, the USS Maddox, was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin in the North China Sea. According to the US National Security Agency at the time, the USS Maddox was attacked by Vietnamese gunboats. In an address that evening, President Lyndon Johnson addressed the American people and stated that the North Vietnamese Navy had been guilty of, quote, aggression on the high seas, and asked Congress for the authority to, quote, take all necessary measures in support of freedom and defence of peace in Southeast Asia. The incident led directly to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by an affirmative vote in the US Congress by a unanimous 1,416-0 vote on the 7th of August 1964. This greatly expanded US military involvement in Vietnam. As a direct result of the Tonkin Gulf incident, Operation Pierce Arrow was launched the very next day, which involved 64 strike sorties from the aircraft carriers Ticonderoga and Constellation against the torpedo boat bases of Hong Gai, Lok Chau, Quang Che and Ben Thoi, and the oil storage depot at Vien in North Vietnam. However, National Security Agency documents released in 2005 show that there was no such attack and that the Vietnamese boats in the region were engaged in a salvage operation of vessels damaged by the Maddox on the 2nd of August 1964. It's not simply that there is a different story as to what happened, it is that no attack happened that night. In truth, Hanoi's navy was engaged in nothing that night but the salvage of the 2 boats that were damaged on the 2nd of August. A year later, President Johnson told his press secretary Bill Moyers that, quote, for all I know, our navy was shooting at whales out there. The Guardian described the Gulf of Tonkin incidents as, quote, dubious radar evidence which was used to legitimise intervention in Vietnam for years to come. In December 2005, the National Security Archive published all the declassified documents acquired regarding the Tonkin Gulf incident and stated that, quote, the parallels between the faulty intelligence on Tonkin Gulf and the manipulated intelligence used to justify the Iraq War make it all the more worthwhile to re-examine events of August 1964 in light of new evidence. The devastating effects on the Vietnam conflict on a physical, emotional and spiritual level are well documented and cannot conceivably be overstated. I'm not going to go into a huge discussion of them because this is incredibly well documented, and there are many films that are just mainstream cinema that give some indication. But in 1995, the Vietnamese government published a study that estimated that 3 million Vietnamese had been killed as a result of the Vietnam War. There was relatively limited US involvement in Vietnam prior to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but on the 4th of December 1961, President Kennedy had authorised the US Defence Secretary at that time, Robert McNamara, to test the military effectiveness of the defoliation of several lines of Vietnamese communication. This is good old Kennedy again. This is Kennedy who's, this esteemed figure in American history, who's a good guy. This was presumed to be an effective form of strategy due to Vietnam's immense areas of jungle. Thus, Operation Ranch Hand was born, a program intended to defoliate trees and plants in the Vietnamese jungle in order to improve lines of communication and also to destroy enemy food supplies. Not happy with merely killing the Vietnamese military, the US also intended to starve them to death. Ran Chan was actually a constituent part of a bigger mission that was entitled Operation Tail Dust. Although there were numerous herbicides produced and utilised as a result of this program, the most infamous and widely used is Agent Orange, which is a mixture of two substances, one pesticide and one acidic substance. During Operation Ran Chan, which ran from 1962 to 1971, the US military forces in Vietnam dumped 80 million litres of defoliants on the country. Arthur Goldston, the biologist whose discoveries Agent Orange was based on, consistently lobbied the US government to stop using it in Vietnam from 1965. President Johnson ignored all of his letters, and his successor Richard Nixon, in the wake of a stalemate of the American military effort, only agreed to stop using Agent Orange in 1970, some 5 years after Goldston began lobbying the government to explain to them how dangerous it was and the kind of effects that it was having on the Vietnamese people. By this time, Vietnamese estimates put the number of people maimed or killed by defoliants at 400,000, and a further 2 million people have suffered cancers or other illnesses. In addition, 500,000 children have suffered from some of the worst birth deformities that you could ever conceivably encounter. If you actually Google Vietnam birth deformities and go to the images, you'll be able to see some of the most harrowing things that you will ever see in your entire life. Yet, those who suffered at the hands of this brutal, indefensible policy have never received any compensation, despite the fact that it continued for half a decade after the time that it was known beyond all doubt by the American government that it was causing these deformities, that it was causing these cancers, and that it was killing hundreds of thousands of people. By 1964, Said bin Taimur, the Sultan of Oman, had received British support as he had acted in their interest regarding Oman's valuable oil commodity, yet towards his own people had engaged in extreme repression. He was facing, at this time, an internal threat that became known as the Dhofar Rebellion. The regime of Said outlawed smoking in public, which must have given someone an idea in Britain, playing football, wearing glasses, shoes or trousers, having electricity or importing medicine, eating in public, or talking to anyone for more than 15 minutes. Actually, some people I've met, I kind of like that law to be imposed on them, but generally speaking, you'd have to say that's quite draconian. This extreme socio-political repression led directly to the Dhofar Rebellion, which was simply driven by a will within Oman to depose this brutal and repressive regime. It was a popular uprising, essentially. The Sultan's response to this was not economic or social reform, or any form of engagement with the rebellion's desire for less stringent living conditions. He simply invoked greater force against the population. Despite the appalling and brutal nature of the Sultan's regime, which was well known in Downing Street, the British openly supported the Sultan throughout the 6-year period up to 1970, deploying both the Royal Air Force and Royal Artillery. By 1969, the strategic position of the Sultan had become, at best, tenuous, with the rebellion becoming increasingly emboldened. It has frequently been asserted that the hawkish actions of Israel during the Six-Day War of June 1967 had strengthened conviction in the region. Thus, by 1970, the Sultan's position was untenable, with the rebellion on the verge of deposing him and installing a new form of government. In response to this, Harold Wilson, who was then the Prime Minister of Britain, sanctioned the removal of the Sultan in a coup, and it was carried out shortly after the June general election. A detachment from the Omani army surrounded the Sultan's palace while British-flown aircraft from the Omani Air Force dropped tear gas bombs, providing cover for a military advance. The Sultan's son was then installed as the new leader of Oman, while the former leader was placed in the Dorchester Hotel in London, where he lived out the remainder of his life, passing away 2 years later. Forces from the SAS then surrounded the new leader, protecting him from further threats. During the next 5 years, British forces burnt down rebel villages and shot their goats and cows. Any recovered corpses were propped up in a corner of the market as a chilling reminder to any other would-be rebels of the potential cost of opposing what was in effect Western rule. By 1975, the last group of rebels had surrendered or crossed the border into the Yemen, and the British-Dutch dominance of Omani oil remained intact. A CIA memorandum dated the 18th of June 1962 shows that President Kennedy wished to continue US efforts to oust Indonesian leader Sukarno, having previously sponsored and armed anti-Sukarno rebels in 1958. Again, this is the great President Kennedy. Little did he know that he himself was to be overthrown rather dramatically within 18 months. As the 1958 attempt had failed, the United States changed strategy and focused on winning over the Indonesian military. Economic aid was cut off to Indonesia completely, while military aid was significantly increased. This strategy was to be utilised successfully a few years later in the overthrow of Allende in Chile. According to the New York Times of the 27th of April 1966, the CIA had completely and thoroughly infiltrated both the Indonesian government and army. Anglo-American actions in Indonesia were to lead to a bloodbath of 1 million deaths. Rumours of a coup had spread throughout Indonesia during 1965, and it has been acknowledged by a retrospective study of the period conducted by the CIA that Sukarno viewed the Americans and British with increasing suspicion in the months leading to the coup d'etat. On the 30th of September 1965, army officers loyal to Sukarno assassinated several generals that they believed were going to run a coup to overthrow him. The instability gave anti-Sukarno generals, led by General Suharto, the opportunity and excuse for the army to move against a force with genuine popular support, the Indonesian Communist Party, also referred to as the PKI. In the months that followed the Suharto-led military were to kill hundreds of thousands of PKI members. Both the British and American governments stated internally that a military government in Indonesia would be preferable to a democratically elected communist regime. US officials stated that, quote, "We are, as always, sympathetic to the Army's desire to eliminate communist influence, and it is important to assure the Army of our full support of its efforts to crush the PKI." The US played a critical role in the consolidation of Suharto and the annihilation of the PKI, providing legal and public recognition and support, covert military and economic aid, designed to bolster the new regime and undermine Sukarno and the PKI, and finally propaganda and information assistance within Indonesia. In the months that followed, Suharto and the army slaughtered hundreds of thousands of PKI supporters and members, estimated to be at least 500,000. Anglo-American high-level communications from that time show that both the British and American governments were well aware of what was going on. The US consulate reported that, quote, "Something like a reign of terror against PKI is taking place. This terror is not discriminating very clearly between PKI leaders and ordinary members with no ideological bond to the party." The CIA reported to the White House frequently throughout the slaughter. On the 25th of November, a British official reported that the Indonesian PKI were being killed in, quote, "very large numbers." Having seized power and receiving Anglo-American endorsement throughout his rule, Suharto's regime invaded East Timor in 1975 and slaughtered a further 200,000 people. The story and the British government's attempts to keep it quiet were reported by the Independent newspaper in October 1999. However, in his 600-page autobiography, then Defence Minister Dennis Healey, the famous Bilderberg Group attendee, you can read an article in The Guardian in which John Ronson, the journalist, interviews him about Bilderberg. Healey, in his autobiography, failed to make one single mention of Suharto's brutal seizure of power, let alone the Anglo-American support and endorsement. During the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War that I previously mentioned, which took place in June 1967, the United States ally Israel attacked the US Navy technical research vessel, the USS Liberty, with jet fighters and torpedo boats. The attack killed 34 US seamen, wounded 171, and severely damaged the ship. The US and British governments staged an inquiry into the attack and came to the conclusion that it was a case of mistaken identity. In 2007, John Crewdson reported for the Chicago Tribune that, having contacted numerous survivors from the incident, not one of them believed the official account. Declassified documents also strengthened doubts about the National Security Association's official account. The document suggests that the US government, anxious to spare Israel's reputation and preserve its alliance with the United States, closed the case with what even some of its participants now say was a hasty and seriously flawed investigation. In 2005, James Bamford had reported the following in The Guardian. At the height of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel attacked a US spy ship, killing 34 men and injuring many more. The Israelis claimed it was an accident, the Americans backed them up. But as James Bamford reveals in his new book, both governments concealed the horrific truth. Despite the overwhelming evidence that Israel had attacked the ship and killed the American servicemen deliberately, the Johnson administration and Congress covered up the entire incident. Johnson was planning to run for president the following year and he needed the support of pro-Israel voters. A mistake or mass murder? It was a question Congress never bothered to address in public hearings at the time. Among those who have long called for an in-depth congressional investigation is Admiral Thomas Maurer, who went on to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Congress to this day, he said, has failed to hold formal hearings for the record on the Liberty affair. This is unprecedented and a national disgrace. Since this incident took place, Israel has received over $100 billion of military aid from the United States, as well as its unstinting support. Here are a few statements that American presidents have made in support of Israel. George Herbert Walker Bush said the following: "The United States and Israel have enjoyed a friendship built on mutual respect and commitment to democratic principles. Our continuing search for peace in the Middle East begins with a recognition that the ties uniting our two countries can never be broken." William Jefferson Clinton made the following statement: "America and Israel share a special bond. Our relationship is unique among all nations. Like America, Israel is a strong democracy, a symbol of freedom and an oasis of liberty, a home to the oppressed and the persecuted." George W. Bush said the following: "We will speak up for our principles and we will stand up for our friends in the world. And one of our most important friends is the State of Israel. My administration will be steadfast in supporting Israel against terrorism and violence and in seeking the peace for which all Israelis pray." Barack Hussein Obama said the following: "The United States was the first country to recognise Israel in 1948, minutes after its declaration of independence, and the deep bonds of friendship between the US and Israel remain as strong and unshakable as ever." Now, I'm not going to go into the whole Israel-Palestine conflict and discuss Israel's decimation and slaughter of the Palestinian people. I'm not going to discuss extensively the US support for Israel and British support for Israel for that matter, because although it hasn't been as extensive as the US support for Israel, it has been as overt and as explicit. So I'm actually going to do a program about that in the future. So I won't discuss Israel any further. But what I would say is, compare the US government's response to the USS Liberty incident, in which they covered up the fact that anything had even happened and refused to blame it on the perpetrators, to that of the Gulf of Tonkin that was fabricated. But even if it wasn't fabricated, you know, one of their ships was fired on by the Vietnamese, so they killed millions of them. They bombed Vietnam with Agent Orange that caused hundreds of thousands of deformities, hundreds of thousands of cancers, killed hundreds of thousands of people. They bombed Vietnam relentlessly with napalm for a decade. I mean, it's virtually impossible to convey in words the psychological, physical slaughter that took place and the effect that it's had on the country, that it continues to have on this country to this day. And it will profoundly affect Vietnam for generations. And that was purely predicated on the USS Liberty incident, on the Gulf of Tonkin incident. That was, even if the official version had been completely 100% correct, and congressional reports now shows that it was not completely 100% correct, then I do not believe he can reasonably describe the Vietnam War as a proportional response to what occurred. Whereas when a very similar incident occurred with relation to the USS Liberty, it was covered up completely. This is simply because Israel serves a very Israel serves a very useful purpose for the United States in the Middle East, and the US are not willing to forgo that particular role of Israel, just so that justice can be done. In 1966, Britain secretly leased Diego Garcia, which comprises the Maldives, the Laccadives and the Caicos Archipelago in the Indian Ocean, to the United States for 50 years, with the option of an extension. In exchange for this, the British received a discount worth millions of dollars on the purchase of Polaris nuclear submarines from the United States. Up until this historical point, the picturesque, unspoiled and tranquil Caicos Islands had formed part of the British colony of Mauritius. However, in order to lease it to the United States, Britain had to avoid surrendering the islands to Mauritius when it became independent in 1968. Thus, in 1965, the British Indian Ocean Territory, as the area is now officially referred to, was created for the sole purpose of setting up a US military base. The British Indian Ocean Territory is the only new British colony to be established since decolonisation, and represents a violation of UN Declaration 1514 of 1960, stating the inalienable rights of colonial peoples to independence, and Resolution 2066 of 1965, instructing Britain to, quote, take no action which would dismember the territory of Mauritius and violate its territorial integrity. Not only did Britain have to effectively steal the islands, it also had to make its people homeless. The US took Diego Garcia only on the condition that all the Caicos Islands were uninhabited, thus the Caicosians had to go. To achieve this, Britain simply pretended that there were no Caicosians and conspired to make sure their unlawful removal went unnoticed. The Foreign Office invented a false history, claiming that the Caicosians were only itinerant labourers with no right of abode on the islands. This was simply a blatant lie, as many Caicosians were fifth-generation islanders. One senior Foreign Office official, however, insultingly described the islanders in a letter as, quote, mere Tarzans and men Fridays. The US and the UK succeeded in keeping secret what had happened for many years, and Diego Garcia is now the largest overseas US military base. On the 3rd of November 2000, the British High Court ruled that, quote, the wholesale removal of the islanders by the British government was an abject legal failure. Thus, a group of Caicosians defeated the Foreign Office and secured the right to return to some of their homeland isles. Even the BBC described this issue as a sordid tale, reporting on Sir Sidney Kentridge QC's description of the Caicosians' forced removal as, quote, a very sad and by no means creditable episode in British history. To this day, some of the Caicos Islanders remain exiled, with both The Guardian and the Daily Telegraph reporting on this recently. The full background to the story of the expulsion of the Caicos Islanders is told in John Pilger's film Stealing a Nation. So the US effort in Vietnam was now drawing to a close. Nevertheless, Richard Nixon remained determined to exit Vietnam in a favourable way, or a way that he viewed as being favourable. The so-called Pentagon Papers, which were declassified documents provided by Daniel Ellsberg, who was a former Pentagon insider, showed that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, another major Bilderberg attendee, one of the people who's principally involved in Bilderberg, casually discussed drowning 200,000 Vietnamese people, as well as using full-scale nuclear weapons, in a conversation that was released as part of these papers and part of the tapes related to them. So I'm just going to play you the clip of this. It's not the best sound quality, but it should hopefully still be clear that Nixon is advocating drowning 200,000 people and using full-scale nuclear weapons in Vietnam.
I still think we ought to take the ice off now. I think to let drown people, we have to calm down about 200,000 people. Well, no, I'd rather see some nuclear bomb if you got that ready. And that, I think, would just be too much. The nuclear bomb, that probably. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
So it's appalling sound quality, but hopefully it should be clear that when Nixon proposed using a nuclear weapon, and even Henry Kissinger, even the insane Henry Kissinger stated that this was going too far, Nixon was audibly annoyed at the fact that Kissinger had decried the idea of using a nuclear weapon and said to him, I just want you to think big, for Christ's sake. So this is what these people are actually like. We see the public image on the public stage where they present themselves as caring about American interests, caring about the American people, and wanting to see democracy spread out. But they will think nothing of dropping a nuclear weapon on people's heads. It was just a throwaway conversation in the Oval Office, just something that Nixon thought, hey, we could just use nuclear weapons. Never been used before. Let's just give it a go, see what happens. And don't doubt that US presidents since then would have done exactly the same thing, and would have proposed exactly the same thing. The only reason we know about this is because it was leaked. I mean, God knows what other conversations have taken place. But you can look at one particular Nixon conversation that he has, which is just absolutely flagrantly racist. He just makes absolutely flagrantly racist statements all the way through the conversation about black people, about Mexicans, and so on. So that's another interesting thing. But all kinds of stuff came out of those tapes. And this is just a few minutes of conversation between Kissinger and Nixon. I mean, we can only speculate as to what was discussed when the likes of Bush were in the White House. Bush who simply won't apologise for US policy. He will never apologise for the United States, as he put it last week, whatever the facts are. He doesn't even care what the facts are, as he put it. He'll never apologise for the United States. So, these are the kind of maniacal psychopathic people that you're dealing with, and we have to face up to that. We can't kid ourselves that they're somehow acting in the interests of our countries, or acting in the interests of our people, or acting in the interests of the people in the nations that they invade, or that some people will believe that the American government and the American president would never harm the American people. Now, why they believe that, I have no idea, because it's on record in things like Operation Northwoods that this was very explicitly considered. This is the US authority that has sterilised black Americans on a massive scale. The only limit to the terror that they will impose upon people, whether these are people of their own nation or people of other nations, is the limit of their imagination and the limit of what they think they can get away with. And that's it. So to move back to discussing Kissinger, Kissinger had previously played a major role in the United States Strategic Air Command bombing of Cambodia, or Operation Menu as it was referred to, during which American B-52 bombers carpet-bombed the region. This campaign served a strategic purpose in relation to the Vietnam War, namely that it was apparently intended to annihilate certain National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam troops. These are frequently pejoratively referred to as Viet Cong. Whether or not this would have been justified, even if one were to accept this supposed justification for the sake of argument, is highly debatable. Kissinger was a fundamental architect and catalyst of this policy. In his own memoirs, The White House Years, he claims that he usurped the obligatory chain of command, whereby commanders in the field customarily received their orders from the President and then the Secretary of Defence. So, for example, in the Operation Northwoods plan, you can see in relation to that the chain of command goes from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Secretary of Defence and finally to the President. This is because the President holds the executive power in the United States. It then goes before the House of Representatives that holds the judicial power. However, Kissinger brags that he, together with Bob Haldeman, Alexander Haig and Colonel Ray Sitton, evolved both a military and diplomatic schedule for the secret bombing of Cambodia. On board Air Force One at Brussels Airport on the 24th of February 1969, quote, "We worked out the guidelines for the bombing of the enemy's sanctuaries." Air Force Colonel Sitton, the reigning expert on B-52 tactics at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, noted that the President was not at the meeting, but had said that he would be discussing the subject with Kissinger. Quote, "Not only was Henry carefully screening the raids," said Sitton, "he was reading the raw intelligence and fiddling with the mission patterns and bombing runs." A memorandum prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and sent to the Defence Department and the White House said plainly that, quote, "Some Cambodian casualties would be sustained in the operation and the surprise effect of attack could tend to increase casualties." It is therefore impossible for Kissinger to claim that he was unaware of the consequences of the bombings of Cambodia and Laos. In fact, he knew more about them and in more intimate detail than any other individual. Several senior members of his own staff, most notably Anthony Lake and Roger Morris, resigned over the invasion of Cambodia, and more than 200 State Department employees signed a protest addressed to the Secretary of State William Rogers. Indeed, as has been noted, both Rogers and the Secretary of Defence Melvin Laird were opposed to the B-52 bombing policy, as Kissinger himself recalls with disgust in his own memoirs. Thus, there can be no defence on his behalf that he was surrounded by yes-men. This was a policy fundamentally drafted and driven by Henry Kissinger. It was once believed that US bombers had dropped just over 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia in approximately 4,000 sorties. This is more than all the bombs dropped on Japan during the Second World War. By way of comparison, Japan has more than double the landmass of Cambodia. Recent evidence has suggested that between 1965 and 1973, the United States dropped 2,756,941 tons worth of bombs in over 230,000 sorties. Furthermore, over 10% of this bombing could be considered indiscriminate, with over 12,000 of the sites bombed acknowledged to be either possessing unknown targets or no targets at all. As a result of these intense bombing campaigns, it has been estimated that at least 350,000 civilians in Laos and 600,000 in Cambodia lost their lives, although these are not the highest estimates, so it'd be nearly 1 million people in total, although other estimates estimate that it was well over 1 million people. Figures for refugees caused by the bombings are several multiples of that. So, there will be millions and millions and millions of refugees caused by these bombings. In addition, the widespread use of toxic chemical defoliants in Cambodia created a massive health crisis which naturally fell most heavily on children, nursing mothers, the aged and the already infirm, and which continues to this day. So that's the US foreign policy from the post-Second World War period, beginning with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki up to the end of the 1960s and the end of the Vietnam conflict. So I'm going to leave it there for today because that's well over an hour's worth of material, and I'm quite sure there's probably a lot more than that still to come. So I'll continue this in part 2 next week. But I just want you to bear in mind when you think about what I've discussed today, when you consider about the slaughter of Cambodia and the slaughter of Vietnam and the overthrow of Mossadegh and the overthrow of Arbenz and the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and all the other things that I've discussed in between, all the British. Should mention the overthrow of the government in Indonesia, which led to 1 million deaths, that was propped up by Britain explicitly. All of these events that caused millions and millions and millions of deaths are constantly proclaimed to be due to British security interests or due to American security interests, or because they're in American interests in some other way, or because they want to spread democracy in the region, or because they want to overthrow a tyrannical government, or because liberal democracy, as they tend to describe it, is a force that will bring peace, that will bring prosperity wherever it is spread, and any means justify this particular aim of the Anglo-American foreign policy. And of course, one of the most frequently stated things I discussed in the introduction to the programme is the quote-unquote special relationship that Britain and the United States has. So, whereby the United States foreign policy has been absolutely reviled all over the world, probably less so in the West than elsewhere, but nevertheless it's had its fair share of critics in Europe. Regardless of this, Britain has continued to support the United States in the United Nations and in the United Nations Security Council. Whatever has occurred, it has never ever openly criticised or openly gone against American foreign policy at any time. It probably never ever will, unless things change radically and unless there's a big change in our thinking and in the way we engage with these issues, and people begin to realise that we've had the wool pulled over our eyes for a very long period of time indeed, and that Britain and America are not great countries in terms of their conduct, and that's just a fact. And I'll be discussing this in more depth next week, this particular concept that neither Britain nor America are good countries. But I just wanted to say finally today that these type of issues are too much for some people, and I understand that. I understand that because most people are basically decent. Maybe people have become a bit self-centered by the kind of consumerist culture that is so dominant in Britain and probably even to a greater extent in America. And of course, we're very strongly incentivised by the prevailing culture to turn a blind eye to these things and to believe that Britain and America are great and to believe that these wars are justified or that they're being driven and instigated by corruption abroad, and there's other countries that are corrupt, and there's a perfectly reasonable and rational explanation why British troops are once again being committed abroad, or why the United States are once again intervening overseas militarily. And there's a huge power in the cultural encouragement to simply go along with it and to turn a blind eye to it. We see in Britain, we see Armistice Day, in which the military parades take place, and all the major political figures make a lot of currency of going out there and looking very grave about it. And we see even the royal family pissing about, standing there with the poppies, pretending that they actually care about the people that have been killed. And even what I've just said in that sentence there would be hugely offensive to a large number of people in Britain, and I'm very well aware of that. And I don't give a shit, because British foreign policy has killed 10 million people since the Second World War. The US foreign policy has killed God knows how many people. It's literally impossible to measure it. So a lot of people are unwilling to face up to that. A lot of people even, I would say, don't even care about it. But you should care, because as I just said, millions of people have been slaughtered. If you're not going to care about that, what are you going to care about? If you don't care about basic loss of life, when we hear that Madeleine McCann's child has been snatched away, which was, whatever your opinion on the subject, it's sad when a child loses its life unnecessarily, and we see a lot of these high profile human interest stories in which children are snatched, and everyone, goes through the details of what's happened and the minutiae of what's happened in absolutely painstaking detail constantly. It has more of an impact on their own life than what's actually occurring to them. Yet this is just one life. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of lives, and tens and tens and tens of millions of people being slaughtered, and tens and tens and tens of millions of people being affected. We can only, again, speculate about the number of refugees, the number of illnesses, and the amount of psychological damage that's been caused by this is just, it's difficult to come up with a word that would truly describe it. I was going to say overwhelming, but I don't think that even comes close. I live in Cheshire. Now, it's fairly quiet around here, as you can probably imagine, and some people. There are areas of ghettoisation within Britain. There are massive areas of ghettoisation within the United States. So I don't want to say that everyone lives in a state of peace within Britain and the United States. It's not true. But we certainly don't have to deal with anything like Vietnam has dealt with. Now imagine if just for one night, let's pick a part of Cheshire that everyone's heard of, Macclesfield, for example. Let's say that Macclesfield was bombed with napalm continually. Just tomorrow night, we woke up and it was on the news. The United States has decided that Macclesfield needed to be bombed with napalm, so they've just been engaging in dozens of sorties overnight. Imagine the news the next day. Imagine what we would see. Imagine the horror, and imagine what a huge part of our culture and what a huge part of our history it would become. Just as 9/11 is held up as being, it's a monumental event in the United States. Yeah, it's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean compared to the horror that they've imposed on others overseas. And yet this happened for day after day after day for over a decade in Vietnam. And when they weren't getting bombed with napalm, they're getting bombed with Agent Orange. And when they weren't getting bombed with Agent Orange and napalm, people were going into the villages and burning them to the ground and slaughtering people, as is very explicitly and graphically portrayed in the film Platoon. So that's just one war. That's just one war in Vietnam. That's a very, very small part, even though historically and culturally it's come to have this massive, it's an icon of the 60s. Nonetheless, that is just one small part of the US foreign policy. We just talked there about, the last thing I talked about was Operation Menu. We slaughtered millions of people, made millions of people into refugees. So if we're not going to care about these issues, then what are we going to care about? And for me, it's the most important thing is just stopping the suffering and the slaughter and the misery that's being imposed by British and American foreign policy. And of course, I haven't even got into the selling of arms all over the world. I want to do a separate programme about Israel-Palestine, and then I'll do another programme about the ties between the banking, military and industrial interests that I call the banking, military, industrial complex. I'll do another programme about that and Israel and make that kind of a dual topic. But I think after next week, there will have been enough war for the time being. So I'm going to move on to discuss some new topics in the new year. But we should be critically concerned about these issues, if only because you have funded all this war effort. You have funded all this slaughter. You have funded all this mass murder. You have funded all this suffering. If you're a British taxpayer, or if you're a United States taxpayer, then you have directly contributed to Operation Menu. You have directly contributed to Vietnam, to Agent Orange being dumped all over the country, to them being bombed with napalm, to 1 million people being slaughtered in East Timor and Indonesia, to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so on and so forth. So you should care for that very reason, because every time you pay your tax dollars or your pounds in Britain, you are contributing to this system. You are contributing to this monolithic, this phenomenal military industrial complex that now exists, that simply wants to stretch out into every region of the world, and it pretty much now has stretched out into every region of the world, with the United States having military bases in 135 nations. So if you're just going to cough up your tax money happily and think, oh well, I don't need to know anything about what foreign policy is because it doesn't really impact on me, it doesn't really affect me, then I think that's pretty poor, and I think people should be very wary of that attitude, no matter how harrowing it is to look at these issues. And it is harrowing. I mentioned a couple of things within this particular programme one of which is looking at the birth deformities in Vietnam. Now, no one is going to get any pleasure out of doing that. No decent human being. I suppose someone who's phenomenally psychopathic might get some sort of pleasure out of it. But no one who's got an ounce of humanity left in their heart is going to look at those images and be anything other than horrified. But we can't just sweep things under the carpet because they're inconvenient for us and because they make us uncomfortable. Particularly when, as I say, our own actions are actually contributing to them. At the very least, realistically, it's very, very difficult to stop this foreign policy in a short period of time because most people are still completely ignorant of it, and they've always been able to attract enough people to go out to these foreign lands and point guns at people, and have used the American and British flag in order to do so, in order to attract people towards it, and in order to make people think that they're somehow defending the land of the free. Somehow, I don't know how they possibly conceivably could think that, considering that the land of the free never actually gets attacked by anyone, and never will get attacked by anyone, because, as I was discussing last week, if they ever were attacked by anyone, the country that actually attacked them would be decimated and annihilated. We've seen what the consequences of 9/11 were, which can't be said to have been an attack by a sovereign nation, but the effect on several other sovereign nations has been pretty terrible, with Afghanistan obviously being directly attacked, and then Iraq strongly being tied to the war of terror, strongly being tied to the war on terror, and even in the United States being tied to 9/11, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever. And then, the drone bombing of Pakistan, the drone bombing of Somalia, and still to this day we see Al-Qaeda and the war on terror and so on and so forth being used as justification for all manner of US foreign policy. Most notably, they have been citing the fact that Iran's been training terror suspects and harbouring terror suspects as part of the propaganda against Iran. So this is something we need to bear in mind, and it's something that it's not going to change today, it's not going to change tomorrow, it's not going to change next year, it might not change the year, it's not going to change the year after, it might not change in my lifetime, as I say with many of these issues, but simply to sweep them under the carpet or put the blinkers on with regards to them and just carry on thinking that we have no direct involvement in them and that we can't help what's going on and therefore we shouldn't pay any attention and we should just drink the Kool-Aid and suck up the propaganda on them is wrong. And if this programme and the next programme don't give a strong enough indication as to why we should care about these things, then there's nothing else I can do, and I don't know what possibly could get through to you, because this is just a relentless discussion and a relentless account of the thousands and thousands and millions and tens of millions of people that have been directly affected by British and foreign policy in a completely unjustified manner, time and time and time again. Time and time and time again, they've gone against all of the supposed democratic principles, against everything that they state the foreign policy is about, and completely annihilated any notion of democracy and any notion of freedom or liberty, or even decent living standards in most cases for any of these countries. So if we're going to drink at the Kool-Aid on that and we're not going to pay any attention to what's going on, then I don't know what we are going to pay attention to. Anyway, that's all I have to say for this week. So I'll finish the programme there. From next week I'll be picking this up in 1970. So we can just park that to one side for the time being. I'll just remind people to visit the website flippingthepyramid.co.uk, where you can listen to this programme and other programmes like it, including all of my programmes and all of the programmes from the other hosts. You can also listen to this programme again on my YouTube channel, which is Breakdown Radio Show, all one word. But until next week, that's all from me for tonight, so thank you very much for listening.